So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nozipho. I work in entrepreneurship to the point, and I'm honored today to present our paper titled Gender, Trade, and Regional Integration, where we are assessing women entrepreneurs' participation in small business development in AfCFTA within SADC countries. This research is rooted in the work that we do in entrepreneurship to the point, where we focus on advancing inclusive trade and industrial development. So today we will be sharing the insights from the study where we explored whether gender considerations were integrated in the AfCFTA's implementation strategies. So I look forward to engaging with you and hear your reflections. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So I'll start with the introduction and the problem statement, just to set the context of the study. And then I'll give a brief overview of the research purpose and the objectives that helped guide this research. And then I'll move to sharing key themes from the literature review, and then finalize with the importance of this research and why it matters in the context of AfCFTA and women's economic inclusion. Then my colleague Nokwanda will take over from the research methodology, where she'll discuss the data that was collected and how it was analyzed, and also share the limitations that we encountered when we were conducting this research. And then share our research findings, outlining the key themes from the interviews that we conducted with female entrepreneurs as well as key stakeholders before sharing the recommendations for gender responsive policy and implementation. So just to start us off, it is important to recognize that the AfCFTA is one of the most ambitious agreements in the continent, which aims to unite 55 countries into one liberalized market. And this agreement is expected to do more than just reduce trade tariffs. It's aimed at reducing trade barriers, strengthen regional value chains, and foster inclusive growth. And within this vision, MMEs play a vital role, more especially in the SADC region. They are the key to innovation, job creation, and creating local economic development. However, despite this potential, there is a critical gap where women entrepreneurs remain largely excluded from formal trade processes and policy support structures. And it is this gap and this missed opportunity that our research focuses on addressing. While the AfCFTA is a promising tool for regional integration and economic transformation, its implementation risks reinforcing existing inequalities if gender is not deliberately mainstreamed. Despite women playing a major role in informal trade and local value chains, they still face systematic barriers, from lack of access to finance, discrimination at border points, and exclusion from policy, and as well as information not forthcoming, and also exclusion from access to markets. We also see that in the absence of intentional inclusion, the structural barriers that have historically hindered women from participating in international trade will persist even under progressive frameworks such as the AfCFTA. And currently, many national strategies under the AfCFTA lack gender-responsive provisions, meaning that women-owned businesses, more especially that operate in small and micro scales, struggle to access benefits from formal trade, And we also noticed that, And we also noticed that regs like SADC and COMESA have more enforceable gender frameworks compared to the AfCFTA. So this table helps us visually compare the depth and the effectiveness of the AfCFTA in comparison to existing regs such as the SADC and COMESA, EAC, and ECOWAS. And we see that under gender clauses, AfCFTA currently has 2 clauses, and the mention of women is just a symbolic mention. It's not really practical, whereas regs, what we see with regs like SADC is that They embed 20 gender-specific clauses with clear commitments across sections. And when it comes to measurability, the AfCFTA's commitments are broad and non-specific with no clear timeline or targets, while regs like SADC, on the other hand, include time-bound targets, measurable indicators, and even reporting obligations. On enforcement, the AfCFTA lacks a dedicated mechanism for tracking or enforcing gender integration. While in contrast, regs have stronger institutional frameworks, including oversight bodies, gender committees, and in some cases, even sanctions like measurements. On enforcement, okay, for the sake of time, I'll move on to the next slide because I don't want to discuss the whole table. So the purpose of this research is to investigate how women entrepreneurs are positioned within the AfCFTA framework in SADC, and also explore whether national and regional policy processes are addressing gender equity. And this research was guided by 3 core learning questions. First, we wanted to investigate how gender considerations have been incorporated into the AfCFTA implementation strategies across SADC countries, understand the opportunities and barriers that women entrepreneurs face in cross-border trade and regional value chains. Lastly, to identify policy and entrepreneurship support gaps that hinder women's participation in regional trade. Just to go over the literature review, we see that the general sentiment is that trade is widely recognized as a key to economic growth and industrialization and regional integration in Africa. However, there is an underutilized potential, which has been discussed in other sections, during other sessions as well, that intertrade made up just 14.9% of the continental trade in 2023, which is a slight rise from the 13.6% in 2022. While this shows progress, it's still below, below regions like Europe and Asia, which account for about 70 to 60%. And it's also recognized that AfCFTA is a game changer as it aims to reduce trade barriers, integrate markets. However, there are equity concerns as trade liberalization often benefits larger formal businesses and leaves small businesses, and more specifically, women-owned businesses behind. Another concern, or a critique rather, is excessive market integration without safeguards reduces national policy space and worsens inequality. So the challenge is that the pre-existing conditions that regs like SADC that we discussed previously are trying to solve those problems. However, now if you implement the AfCFTA without any safeguards, it might unintentionally exacerbate the current existing challenges. And then literature review, going deeper into more gender lens, we know that while trade agreement promotes market access, women-owned businesses are still left behind, as well as small businesses. And women-owned businesses are overrepresented in informal businesses as they lack access to markets, which excludes them from formal market provisions. Another challenge is that, a study by UNECA shared their findings that women make up 70% of informal cross-border traders, but women still face harassment at border points, extortion, where they're expected to make payments, which pushes them to more informal trading. So access to finance still remains a major barrier for women, where some of them intentionally exclude themselves because they lack financial literacy, or maybe they're discouraged from the lending bias that they've continuously faced, as they're seen as more riskier compared to their male counterparts. And border and harassment, as I've already mentioned before, that there are some countries like Zimbabwe and Mozambique where women have said that they've faced extortion and even sexual harassment, forcing them to move into informal markets. Also, there's lack of information and network inclusion, especially if the information is shared in networks that are hard to access for women that don't have maybe Wi-Fi, such things like Wi-Fi or internet access. And also, sorry, the last one. The last one is societal norms that prevents women into speaking up in rooms like this, where they have a voice in the implementation and also the policy making of frameworks like the AfCFTA. And when we looked at the literature, we noticed that there's limited gender-responsive analysis of AfCFTA's implementation. There's also insufficient intersectional lens and underrepresentation of women's voices and weak coverage of sectoral and regional variations. Lastly, there's scarce data on informal trade and cross-border dynamics. Therefore, this research fills an empirical evidence gap.
Sorry, I think you can skip the slide, skip your methodology. Maybe let's get to your findings, just so that we're able to get
the
to
time. Okay, sorry about that.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the paper will be shared just so that you can read extensively how we went about conducting the research. But essentially, yes, primary data, secondary data, so it was mixed methods. We conducted semi-structured interviews with women entrepreneurs and with trade experts. Some of the limitations, though, was although we applied a regional lens, it was really guided by both practical and strategic considerations, but we deliberately framed the study within the broader SADC context, as South Africa is also a key member of this REC, but because of time, we specifically focused on South Africa. Sample size was also another limitation. The small number of participants means that maybe the findings may not really capture the full diversity of experiences across different sectors or geographies, but their insights also just offer really valuable first-hand experiences that reflect their real and lived experiences. All right. Okay, so the findings. So we know the AfCFTA is a transformative opportunity for inclusive growth. SADC submitted a joint tariff offer covering 90% of its tariff book and enabling preferential trade among compliant AfCFTA state parties, with South Africa commencing preferential trade in January 2024 with their first certified consignments exported to Ghana and Kenya. And the Protocol on Women and Youth in Trade was approved by Cabinet in February 2025, ratified in June 25, but implementation is still pending. Can skip the slide. Right, so assessing gender integration through the eyes of women entrepreneurs. So to better understand how South Africa's AfCFTA commitments are materializing into, concrete opportunities, particularly for women entrepreneurs, the section really draws on direct engagements that we had with women-led organizations, particularly for, women-led I've lost my train of thought. Yes, across the construction, services, and the food sectors. So the questions that we posed to them were designed to really uncover their level of awareness, firstly, of the AfCFTA, assessed its perceived relevance to them as women-owned businesses, and also really explore both the opportunities and some of the structural barriers that they face in pursuing some cross-border trade. So when it came to the awareness of the actual instrument, it was ranged from vague recognition to complete unfamiliarity, with only one entrepreneur having a working understanding of what the AfCFTA is. For many, its relevance to their business was either unclear or just perceived as too distant to really impact their immediate growth trajectories. Go back. So just one of the quotes, I'm looking at cross-border trade because of the potential to earn, especially in Africa. So this just identifies that this highlights that despite their varying levels of awareness, several entrepreneurs are still eager to explore the regional market, particularly in neighboring countries. Sorry, we are Speedy Gonzalez over here because of time. barriers and structural challenges. So across interviews, women consistently identified multi-layered interlinked barriers to regional trade. You've got your regulatory and operational complexity, where they found that it's difficult navigating, differing rules of origins, licensing and customs, etc. Financial and logistical constraints, high costs of transport, warehousing, and just the needing of local offices, with one entrepreneur mentioning that she does have an opportunity to trade regionally, but she would have to set up local offices in that country, which was Mozambique, and that's expensive for her. Gender and sectoral biases, discrimination in male-dominated sectors where women are seen as inexperienced and less backed by men. So one entrepreneur said, when you're a woman in construction, they don't take women seriously, they take you as a young girl. Information gaps, a lot of the entrepreneurs that we engaged with really do not know where to go, where to find the information, etc. Maybe next slide to some of the support access. So we tried to gauge if any of the entrepreneurs had managed to access support with their ambitions to trade regionally. And only one entrepreneur mentioned that she a minimal trade-specific support, which included export training from a qualified professional, product coding for export classification, guidance to the register with the Chamber of Commerce, and consulting with a bank manager to assess any financial risks associated with trading.
Okay, I'm going to start singing now.
All right. Policy recommendations. All right. So yeah, we have 3 thematic findings, obviously from the KIIs, from the experts, which really also kind of put a tick onto what was coming out from literature as well. But just to conclude some of our policy recommendations, strengthens export readiness support for women entrepreneurs. Women entrepreneurs are ready to take up opportunity. Women entrepreneurs are ready to go outside of South Africa, but they need the support. They need people. They need us, those who are able to get into the rooms and to advocate for them, to really, assist them. Expand access to gender sensitive financing. So, really just partnering to channel those fundings to women SMEs, ensure safe and more transparent border processes, improving access to trade information, investing in digital trade, and institutionalizing gender disaggregated monitoring and evaluation and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is going to be Nompumelelo Ndawonde, who is going to be looking at formalization and the implications. Nompumelelo, maybe please you can just tell us about your studies, skip the methodology, and then we can just go to your research findings and your recommendations.
Afternoon, colleagues. So my topic is on Zimbabwean women informal cross-border traders. I'm not going to go too much into the background of it all, but I think we've all heard today that AfCFTA has been championed the most ambitious integration projects in Africa. And at the center of my chapter is the question, who is this integration for? When we look at the economic landscape in the continent, informal economies dominate, particularly women informal cross-border traders who are not just participants within these economies, they are the very backbone. They account for between 70 to 80% of these informal cross-border traders. And this includes Zimbabwean women, ICBTs as well. They carry the weight of their entire households using this informal trade. Their trade is adaptive, it's essential, yet in many contexts is still considered precarious or illegal. Much of the current policy discourse frames formalization as the natural solution for those who are in the informal economy. Just register, pay your taxes, and comply with the regulations. But this narrative really oversimplifies the reality, particularly where formal institutions are predatory or weak, rather. They can become more of a burden than a benefit for these women, particularly without addressing some structural exclusion and barriers like corruption, gender-based violence, and financial exclusion. We run the risk of eroding the very resilience that has kept many of these women afloat. So I'm not going to read the questions, but I think they're quite self-explanatory. Just looking at the FTA and what it says about ICBTs, the implications of formalization, as well as structural challenges. Next slide, please. So I briefly conceptualize ICBT, and it's quite clear it's just trade between neighboring countries. It's usually small scale, conducted by vulnerable traders that bypass official custom channels, not necessarily because they're illicit, but because usually the regulations in place are too burdensome, or they're inaccessible, or they're quite hostile. So the term itself, informality, might suggest illegality, but this is further from the point. Trade usually involves legally produced goods. The informality lies in the absence of the state recognition and support. So this means that informality itself exists along a spectrum. So when it is beneficial, they will engage formally, and when it is not, they will not. I won't go into the categorization of traders, but I will say for Zimbabwean women ICBTs, they don't quite clearly fit into any of these categories because they defy the norm. Essentially, many of them choose to comply when it is beneficial, and when it is not, they avoid it. So it's a very hybrid, fluid approach, which is the way I believe we should be looking at ICBT. It's very complex, and in this case, it's gendered. Next slide, please. So I won't go too much into the Zimbabwean historical trajectory and how there became the rise of informal economies, but we can all understand colonialism, apartheid, structural adjustment programs, women being excluded from formal employment and thus having to trade informally. They essentially became the last line of defense in sustaining their families when everything else, including banks, pensions, salaries, had failed, and they became the pillars of national survival in Zimbabwe. Next slide, please. So what does the AfCFTA say or does not say about women in ICBTs? The protocol promises market access, competitiveness, expanded regional value chains, but for whom is the AfCFTA made accessible? So I've shown on the screen where women or gender equality are mentioned very briefly, but it's not quite substantive. The Women and Youth Protocol does provide a little bit more flesh to the matter. It promises commitments such as access to finance, trade, information protections, as well as protections against gender-based violence. But again, these aspirations remain largely rhetorical unless they are translated into enforceable obligations, resourced strategies, and binding gender targets. We also need to think about what AfCFTA means when it talks about value chains. I assume that when the AfCFTA speaks of value chains, they speak of women entrepreneurs, informal SMEs who already have access to capital, who participate in export-ready industries, who are plugged into regional production hubs, and not so much women who operate in the informal economy, where they don't have access to capital, where they've had to create informal distribution networks and cash-based transactions, and make use of non-standard logistics. So looking at the lived realities of these women was a very critical section of the chapter. Next slide, please. Trading across borders is anything but simple for these women. They have to navigate a minefield of structural, social, and economic barriers. Things such as lack of capital, again, has led to many of them having to use predatory loan sharks, poor infrastructure at borders, having to sleep in dangerous, unhygienic spaces, corruption, bribes, confiscation of goods, gender-based violence, and harassment. But despite this, these women have continued to strive. They build support systems, informal logistic networks, rotating savings, informal legal advice circles, and most importantly, they contribute to regional economics quite significantly. So when the AfCFTA talks about formalization, we must ask, do these frameworks reflect the lived realities of those in the informal economy? And we must begin to reimagine policy not as an imposition, but as a supportive structure that meets women where they are in the informal economy at the border posts. So given what AfCFTA has said and the lived realities of these women, where are the prospects? The IOL's decent work agenda and its 4 pillars: promotion of employment, rights at work, social dialogue. These are not just abstract rhetorical ideas. These are real, tangible tools that can be used and implemented. This agenda is particularly crucial for women because even though they do operate at the margins of formal labor law, they are still workers. And without these social security safety nets, and access to labor protections, their work is in most cases then becomes illegal, and they are unprotected. It's a very much rights-based approach that demands protection for workers. I've also made mention of the trade union advocacy groups in the continent, but I won't go into that. And then ultimately, then what does formalization truly mean for Zimbabwean women ICBTs and women ICBTs in the continent in general? These women have not waited to be included. They already are very active in this economy, holding up households, communities, and even national GDPs. The Pan-African payment system has come up quite a bit today as also a prospect, and just in terms of digital infrastructure. But then we'd also have to look at literacy gaps around that, and also ensuring that the policies are anchored in labor justice as well as centered on dignity protection for these women. I think I can stop there.
Thank you, Nompumelelo. Anybody has a question, comment for any of the speakers that have presented so far? Or if maybe the speakers have something they would like to add to their presentations? Or I could just sing. I'm not a very great singer. I know you guys, I rushed you. Do you want to add? No, like if you want to add to, yeah, what you were saying. You don't have what was sort of.
My goodness, I was Speedy Gonzalez, so I don't even know where I ended off. But essentially what we were trying to gauge from our study was the awareness of the AfCFTA amongst women entrepreneurs, right? Because if we're saying that this is a trade agreement that's supposed to advance not only the continent, but also, you know, previously disadvantaged groups, then do those groups are they even aware of the instruments that are available to them? And it was really disappointing to just hear some of the experiences from those who are already trading informally to those who don't even have the ambition to do so because it's either expensive or, you know, they're scared of being scammed, or, you know, there's just different reasons that are specifically women-centric that we also just need to take into consideration. So we're okay. Oh, the KIIs. So we also engaged with trade experts. So from, you know, SETFA that are also running programs such as the She Trades program that, you know, capacitates women entrepreneurs that are in the trade space. And a lot of the issues that also came up also from the entrepreneurs and just from the literature. So there's, I think in conclusion, there's just a lot that just needs to be done. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think my name is Evans Rubara. I come from Tanzania. I work with artisanal small-scale miners and their communities. And I think that the sector you're talking about, the business, it takes me back to what I'm doing back home. And when we were having the first session at the auditorium, the main auditorium, there is the issue which you're raising right now with what you just said, that AfCFTA seems to come with what I would call predictive measures and not speculative. When you talk about speculative futures, you're talking about collaborative kind of an assessment where you have your constituents informed, aware of what is going on. And that obviously should come with some sort of an assessment of capacities among your constituents. This raises a question. I really don't have a question for you, but I was just going to say that when I take the experience I've had with artisanal small-scale miners who are very fluid, you find fishermen, fisherwomen, smallholder farmers shifting between mining, fishing, and agricultural activities, you realize that they are not involved from the beginning. And I'm wondering whether AfCFTA is actually using these predictive measures which have been used over the time by the World Bank to actually come and impose. So I think that it is important from what you're talking about that awareness be made available for everyone who can actually take part in this. We always talk about ripple effects that comes from the top, but then can we think about something which is vertical and horizontal and how we can actually make sure that no one is left behind? Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the room?
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Achisanang Mahua, and I'm from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at UCT. I'm interested in your thoughts because you were looking at SADC, and we know that the RICS are building blocks to the AfCFTA. What do you think, what is that one takeaway of something that you learned from SADC? Because it sounded as if you're saying SADC is doing very well when it comes to women participation in trade. What is that one thing you think could be a learning that could be adopted for the AfCFTA based on what you've learned from the readings in SADC implementation?
If you still remember the table that we showed earlier, the RICS that exist in SADC, most of them are more gender focused and more gender responsive, and the women are able to benefit from trade processes, and there's more government influence from SADC. The government is involved in making sure that women are included, especially in financial spaces and giving them access to finance. The challenge is that now is at the border, where women face harassment and extortion, where nobody respects you. The opportunities are there, and women are able to participate in international trade. But when you get to the border, like Nwanda had mentioned before, that there was a comment that says, if you're at the border and you're a woman, people don't take you seriously unless you come with a male friend or a male business partner. So most of the issues that we picked up were more societal and maybe gender differences where men don't respect women. But the opportunities that something that we can learn from SADC is that as South Africans, they are more focused on women inclusion compared to us, which our policies are just more vague compared to theirs.
Sorry, follow up on that one. So when you talk about women getting to the border, are you talking about women in formal businesses, or is it informal? Informal. Oh, so it's the same issue as this one. Has anybody looked at formal businesses? Granted, there's like 2 of them, but sorry. Yes. All right, we've got it. Charles, please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon to you all. I'll present on the topic, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and gender. My presentation will be very brief, starting from the background, some aspects of the literature review, methodology, key findings, recommendations, summary, and conclusion. As we are quite aware, to effectively exploit the opportunity offered by trade, developing countries have been constrained on two fundamental fronts. One is to enhance trade negotiations, where issues pertinent to them make it onto the agenda. Secondly, is to put a corresponding domestic policies and support systems towards enhancing trade effectiveness. At the 18th Ordinary Session of the African Union on the theme boosting inter-African trade, heads of member states have actually agreed to establish the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to alter the pattern of trade flows and defend domestic markets from trade liberalizations. Of course, this agreement actually came into existence to create a single market and also to promote industrial development. It has laid a very strong foundation for promoting Africa's trade competitiveness and industrial development. However, it is essential to consider how gender dynamics plays significant role in the integration process. Of course, making reference to the African Index report on gender, it has clearly shown that 50 to 3% of women actually engage themselves in vulnerable activities, most specifically in the informal sectors, which made the larger shares of that particular sectors. Making reference to Article 3 of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which actually geared towards promoting and enhancing sustainable and inclusive growth, and also geared towards gender equity. That has been a significant objectives in enhancing women empowerment and foster access to markets. It is quite interesting to know that the ACP lays strong foundations for African trade competitiveness in the global markets. Just as I've said, women have actually enhanced the largest shares in terms of trade negotiation, despite the fact that they are very much constrained in terms of enhancing their needs. Of course, what are some of the areas that my research actually explore? It explores how the African Continental Free Trade Agreement could give or serve as a catalyst for promoting gender equality. It also served on how trade policy could be redesigned to promote women participation and enhancing gender equality. Furthermore, it examines opportunities of women in trade and sectors where women can benefit from increasing trade opportunities. Notwithstanding, it also examines the gender barriers and access to markets. Furthermore, it also highlights some of the cultural and social norms that normally impede women participation in terms of market access and in terms of enhancing their trade opportunities towards international markets. Ladies and gentlemen, my research actually drawn up on some of the imperatives I've identified in my studies. Historically, trade agreements often overlooked on different gender impacts. Of course, women's roles in the informal sector will be also be marginalized under the legal and regulatory framework. Of course, African women have faced systemic barriers in terms of market access and also in terms of benefits from increasing trade opportunities. Notwithstanding, there are aspects of gender barriers to market access, limited participation in policies, and underrepresentation when it comes to trade negotiation. Of course, the issue of gender-based violence and harassment has been very much significant. Lack of gender mainstreaming and economic values, gender insensitive legal and regulatory framework. Notwithstanding, The lack of access to critical resources, such as capital, land, has been very much fundamental, and that has impeded women participation in terms of decision-making processes, in terms of having access to the international market. Of course, in terms of cross-border trade, they are very much being constrained in terms of lack of registration, lack of documentations, and legal recognitions. However, women remain underrepresented in terms of the trade negotiation and decision-making within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Gender mainstreaming to legal and regulatory framework had not been addressed. The absence of gender-sensitive mechanisms. Last but not the least, of course, women are very much challenged in terms of cross-border trade. They face various gender-based violence and also have limited access to some of the digital tools that would enhance them accessing information in terms of decision-making, in terms of exports and imports of their commodities. In many African countries, as highlighted by some of my colleagues, traditional gender role has also impacted women participation in terms of cross-border trade. Notwithstanding, all of these have actually motivated for me to actually focus on the role of gender, on the role of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in fostering gender empowerment and market access. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the significance of this study is actually to show how gender dynamics interplays. It also gives us an insight on how we can enhance growth, stimulate market access, and enhance industrialization. It also further or give us a kind of a rating on how we could redesign trade policies and also redesign some of the policies within the ACP agenda to foster and enhance women participation in decision-making, to enhance women participation in trade negotiation, and enhance their success in terms of competitiveness. Because the literature review has anchored on several issues, and some of these issues are anchored, firstly, on some of the key provisions of the ACP in promoting gender equality. Because Richard have clearly highlighted some of the key provisions, such as exploration of operations, custom cooperations, trade facilitation, eliminations of tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, sensitive and excluded products, to name a few. The removal of technical barriers, sanitary and psychosocial sanitary measures, and also technical assistance and capacity building process. Ladies and gentlemen, it's worthwhile to ask the question, what the potential impact of ACP on gender equality and women empowerment? Of course, one of the potential impacts, as highlighted from the literature review, was to address the prevalence of gender inequality in the various sectors, ranging from agricultural, manufacturing, and the service sector. Other studies have highlighted those gender dynamics. Notwithstanding, it is very important for us also to have a critical look on how immigration-related challenges impede women access to cross-border trade and also their access to the international market. Some of these immigration trade barriers are geared towards immigration, mainstreaming in terms of gender, simplification of custom procedures, rules, and harmonization of custom procedures. All of these have served as a deterrent in enhancing women participation in cross-border trade. Notwithstanding, the need for harmonization is very much fundamental if really we want to enhance women participation and enhancing their access to the international market. Custom information has also been one of the fundamental barriers that impedes women in terms of cross-border trade. Of course, with the elimination of tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, of course, that will give a headway for them to enhance and mitigate the impact of economic inequalities. The question I would like to raise is why African country needs to integrate. It's very fundamental. That's anchored on two fundamental aspects. One is that the continent is very much vulnerable to external shocks. Of course, the market size has been also one of fundamental areas we should take cognizance of. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very much fundamental for us to know some of the gender implications to enhance trade opportunities for women. Of course, right from the agreement, it has been clearly stated that some of these agreements normally overlooked gender dynamics. Of course, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement normally offer opportunity to examine some of these gender imperatives. Of course, it's worthwhile for trade policy, not only to promote economic integration, but also to consider how they should also address gender dynamics. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to highlight some of the few gender barriers that would enhance women's access to trade opportunities. Of course, market access and participation have been very much fundamental. Limited participation in terms of policies and decision-making have also served as an impediment towards women's participation in terms of trade opportunities. Notwithstanding unequal access to trade-related technology and also information have also served as an impediment towards enhancing trade opportunities. All of these serve as barriers towards women's participation in enhancing access to the international market. Notwithstanding, limited access to trade finance has been very much significant. Gender insensitivity with respect to the legal and regulatory frame have also served as an impediment. Last but not the least, cause cultural and social norms in terms of the women's cultural roles have also impacted. It's not, however, withstanding that there is a need for us to enhance and foster women's participation in terms of trading relations. One way to enhance is to augment and uplift gender opportunities under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. How can that be achieved? Of course, there is a need to reduce procedural challenges that normally impede women's access. Secondly, to enhance access to finance, very fundamental, and fostering digital inclusion. All of this compounded would enhance women's access to market opportunities, and that would foster their participation in terms of trade negotiation and also augment their inequalities. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also worthwhile for us to take the opportunity of what? Of incorporating e-commerce, building the capacity and collaboration among women. Also an inclusive growth, which is very much fundamental. However, it is worthwhile to ensure that there are areas where women can increase their trade opportunities. Various sectors such as agricultural sectors, textile and informal sector. These are very fundamental sectors that women can make advantage in enhancing and improving their trade opportunities. Of course, the concept of inclusive growth is very fundamental when we talk about trade dynamics in terms of gender. Of course, it's very fundamental to know how this inclusive growth can be achieved that would spur and foster women's participation in terms of enhancing gender equality. Of course, three critical elements when we talk about inclusive growth in fostering trade opportunities, gearing towards women, is as a result of improved market access, industrial development, and also ensuring economic diversification. These are very much fundamental if really we want to enhance women participation. Notwithstanding, the methodological approach I adopted is a kind of mixed methodology.
Charles, sorry, I'm going to have to give you 2 minutes just to get to your findings and close up.
Yes, of course, I used a mixed methodological approach wherein I incorporated case studies, interviews, targeting various trade stakeholders. I also ensure that all of these interviews have been coded and impounded into various statistical instruments. Notwithstanding, of course, some of the findings and key areas I've highlighted in terms of my research findings as follows. One, market access. It's very fundamental for us to enhance women's access to markets. Also ensure their inclusion in terms of having access to finances. Also, the aspect of digitalization is very much important because with digitalization, that will enhance their information within and make confined decisions on imports and exports of their traded commodities. Of course, market expansion has been very much fundamental. Of course, that can only be enhanced towards a redesign, a rethink of our strategies towards women empowerment. Lastly, of course, the incorporation of agricultural value chain has been very much fundamental in terms of cross-border agreements. Because all of these compounded with enhanced and effective and decisive position on how we could enhance women participation in decision. Ladies and gentlemen, It's high time for us to enhance market access, digitalization, financial inclusion, and also the redesign and rethink of our policy in the area of elimination of tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, simplification and harmonization of trade policies that would enhance women participation. All of these would also compound and geared towards mitigating the impact of inequality, access to market, access to trade negotiation. Last but not the least, it's worthwhile to mention some of this recommendation. The integration of gender dynamics into the ACP policy framing, that has been lacking, because my research has clearly highlighted that there is a need for us to integrate gender into the ACP policy, and also to promote women access to financial and economic resources, very fundamental, capacity buildings and skill development in the area of business development skills, access to literacy in terms of cross-border trade, ensuring women participation in the value chain within the various sectors. That's why diversification is very much fundamental, because all of these recommendations would also include women participation in terms of market access. Improving infrastructure is very fundamental, and access to other areas of market penetration. Of course, the area of gender sensitivity, trade facilitation measures, because in the form of what? Elimination of all tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, promoting regional collaboration, networking, very fundamental, and also policy coordination among various key stakeholders, as I've identified from my sampling. Promotion of regional collaborations, monitoring and evaluation of gender outcomes, awareness raising, advocacy program towards enhancing women participation in terms of trade negotiation, in terms of competitiveness, and in terms of value addition. All of these will enhance success. Last but not the least, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement doesn't actually exploit or explicitly exploit just only gender, but it also exploits some of the provisions underneath. You see, women have faced various cross-border trade, and also there is a need for proactive measures, as highlighted, to ensure the benefits from the provision from the ACP. Of course, the reduction of tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers is very fundamental, and the harmonization of policies, which is very much true. Last but not the least, of course, gender mainstream.
Charles?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I think let's leave it there. We'll share the papers with people who are interested. Okay, so we are almost out of time. I don't know if people can take 5-10 minutes on the other side of 3 o'clock for questions.
Mainstreaming of gender. Thank you.
Charles?
Yes.
All right. Lisa, I'm going to start with you. You had your hand up. Do we have questions online? All right. So we'll start with Lisa here, and then colleagues can raise their hands if they've got questions.
This question is for Nokwanda and Nozipho. So considering the intersection between women and youth, how can we promote and encourage youth participation in entrepreneurship, where they will need to create their own employment opportunities, particularly in the informal economy in South Africa, considering our youth unemployment rate is at its highest? Alongside the accessibility factor, the availability factor is the issue. Are we going to leave this solely up to business and the private sector?
A lot has been said today about the level of awareness that people have, especially women, with respect to the AfCFTA. And I'm just thinking, what are your recommendations? What can we do? Because a lot of doom has been talked about today about what the challenges are, and just a lot of focus on the challenges can sometimes be overwhelming, and it looks like there is no way forward. So what can we say are the low-hanging fruits? What can we take away from this conversation today that we can start to do from where we are? We regulators, we may not be the authorities, but what are your recommendations in terms of low-hanging fruits to increase awareness and make sure that the people in the private sector who actually do the trading, because it's not countries that trade, it's people in countries that trade. So what can we do? What do you think based on your experiences? Thank you. Any other over there? Okay, we will take.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Francis. I'm from a company called Drisa Consulting Service. This one. Thank you so much. So my questions are directed to Nompumelelo. So as you were presenting, I was just taking some notes, which then led to my question. So I would like to ask, isn't formalization ultimately necessary when you look at access to finance, protection, and scalability? And then also, how can you argue for informal systems when they are inherently insecure? Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the presentation. Super interesting. Dambisa from the German chamber here. I was asking this question to my colleague next to me, I know, but against the backdrop of the session before lunch, the session now, I think a lot of gaps are highlighted, a lot of challenges are highlighted, and the age-old gap between implementation versus policy, I think we're kind of burdened with that on the continent. My question then is to both. You both highlighted the exclusionary patterns, specifically as it pertains to women in trade participation. So do you think that the AfCFTA is a good instrument? Is this something, are we on the right track? Sure, we want to improve it, want to strengthen it, but I'm struggling a little bit to walk away from today having an understanding of, are we on the right track, or is it a matter of we're here now and we need to make it work?
Okay, Nompumelelo mentioned that the concept of a value chain often refers to those that are formal, women that already have access to the relevant infrastructure in finance, right? Your presentation actually highlighted my gripe with policy, that I feel like policy should aim to meet people where they are. Those women see value in what they do because that's the source of their livelihoods, that's the source of their livelihoods. So now if we're saying, oh, we're trying to build value chains, we're trying to improve value chains, then the question becomes, who are we creating this value for? If we're saying what they're already doing is not valuable, or we're implying that it's not valuable. So I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question, but that was just something that, you know, just that really came up when you were doing your presentation. Thanks.
Cool. All right. All right. So we will take responses from the speakers in the room, and then we will close with Charles. Charles, if you could perhaps respond to the first question that was asked, or the second question that was asked in terms of what can be done, what are the low-hanging fruit, essentially, but also the speakers in the room can speak to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Charles, hang on, let's start with the room and then we'll get back to you.
Okay, is this way?
I'll let you know when you can respond.
So I'll answer the first question on advancing youth participation on entrepreneurship. So we currently recently published a study that we did with Alan Gray Opus Foundation, where we interviewed young entrepreneurs in asking them what exactly do they need in also for them to be successful as entrepreneurs, and also for young people to see entrepreneurship as an alternative instead of just looking for a 9-to-5. And the key themes that we highlighted was that the first thing, they need a government that trusts them. Our government doesn't trust our youth. You know, some people still have challenges with 2Ks, which I always say at work that I believe in them, that they will change whatever that's happening in the country. So the first key area that they faced was that it's access to finance and startup capital. So if the government or private sector could provide youth with that, they will be able to see entrepreneurship as an alternative instead of the 9-to-5. Tailored training and mentorship, like the work that we do at Entrepreneurship to the Point, where we do business development training, market access and value chain inclusion. One of the guys that we interviewed, who's an entrepreneur, said that he started a bakery at one of the locations in Vaal, and now with the influx of illegal foreigners, He was told that he needs to close his shop because he's not allowed to sell there. So we need the government that's going to protect our young people from illegal foreign in order for them to participate in markets. And the last one was regulation support and the ease of doing business. We all know about the red tape that's hindering businesses, even old businesses, from participating in the markets.
Okay, I will respond to is the AfCFTA on the right track? I wish I had a distinct answer for that. I would say the ambitions are on the right track, right? Creating one African market, creating an inclusive market, that's on the right track. But what our study revealed was that the people that are actually supposed to benefit from what the AfCFTA is promising aren't aware of it. So a lot needs to be done with capacitation, with knowledge sharing, etc. And then maybe just to kind of touch on what are the low-hanging fruits and what we can do now. Partnership, creating tangible guides. If I'm a woman entrepreneur and I want to take advantage of some of the AfCFTA opportunities, how will I go about it? If we had to co-create some form of guide that says, all right, if this is your sector, these are the requirements that you need, these are the compliance documents that you need, etc. We've got lawyers in the room who can also come in and, add on to that guide. So having just a little bit of a handbook, which is what Entrepreneurship to the Point we did with an access to finance guide, and women entrepreneurs didn't know, or, women entrepreneurs are experiencing challenges to access to finance. If I want to access finance, through the traditional, the non-traditional finance, financial service providers route, what do I do? How do I go about it? So we, kind of created a space where the financiers are in the room, the entrepreneurs are in the room, and through that process, we're able to then come up with an access to finance guide for the entrepreneur. So, kind of creating something similar to that for trade purposes. Yeah.
Right, let's take Nompumelelo and then, yeah.
Thank you. I will touch on the question of informality and how then are these women supposed to access capital, and then very briefly on the regional value chains, although it was more of a comment, which I very much agree with. Look, I think it is a concern because one of the structural challenges are the fact that these women struggle to access capital, and how then do they access this capital without some kind of formalization? And formalization in itself, I don't think is inherently bad. I think it's the conditions that these women are being asked to formalize into that are the problem. Most of that infrastructure is quite weak. It's corrupt and it can be very hostile. And so that's why I advocate for more of a rights-based approach towards formalization, where let the starting point not be you're in the informal sector, you must formalize in order to be empowered. Why don't we start with gender-sensitive, responsive structures and restructuring, digital platforms, social protections first, and then we invite the women in? Because inviting them into these broken infrastructure, it runs the risk of eroding all the work that they have been able to do. Then touching on the point of the value chains, it's unfortunate that because they operate within the informal sector, their value chains are usually undermined and undervalued. But these are the very value chains that have been contributing to GDPs, that carry households, livelihoods, contribute to food security, and yet when it comes to the policy aspect, these informal value chains are very much undermined. So yeah, I think I'll end there. So I'll go on and on.
All right. Charles, you've got 2 minutes to respond, please, and then I will need to close.
Thank you. I've had all the discussion. The points were very much salient. We realize most of the issues are cut across. The area of formalization, of course, to me, just as my colleague have said, is actually not bad. It's just the condition upon which women are subdued to. Someone asked a question about how we can promote participation. Of course, that was one of the gap actually I highlighted during my studies, that women actually find it very difficult to participate, most especially in terms of trade negotiation, how we can foster that. Of course, the aspect of capacity building, raising awareness about the socioeconomic status, raising awareness about some of these policy geared towards trade is very fundamental, because that would enhance their capacity, it would enhance their skill, their capability, actually, to know how they can enhance those trade opportunities as stipulated within the EU agenda, the basic African Continental Free Trade Agreement agenda. Also, the need actually for harmonization is very fundamental. Harmonization of those trade policies, I think, would also enhance their participation. By harmonizing those trade policies, actually, that would enhance actually the free access to some of these opportunities. As we consider them to be in the informal sector, they are very much vulnerable, and also they are very much disadvantaged in terms of cross-border trade. Some of those disadvantages in terms of gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, harassment has been very fundamental. So if there is a kind of harmonization of trade policies, women can also enhance some of the participation, even in terms of accessing information about decision making as to what they can import and export. Of course, some of the recommendations I would make in terms of awareness raising, of course, there is a need for us to continue in terms of advocacy. Advocacy is very fundamental. Advocating some of those issues would also give them an insight on how they can exploit some of these trade opportunities. And also the aspect of capacity building. A lot of capacity training programs should be enrolled to ensure that there is in-depth understanding about what are some of those fundamental impediment factors that normally impedes their success towards taking advantage of the trade opportunities as embedded in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There is also a need for women to have a kind of a network collaboration, kind of networking in terms of promoting some of their basic needs, in terms of ensuring that some of the gender dynamics issues are clearly addressed. Because on the area of partnership, with regards to the public-private partnership engagement, is very fundamental. We really want to ensure that some of these issues that normally impedes their advantage in taking some of these opportunities as provided should also be taken into cognizance. Last but not the least, someone also talk about regulatory support, because this actually overlap with the first issue I've highlighted, regulatory framework. That should be legal and concise regulatory framework with regards to gender imperatives. Of course, the regulatory framework needs to be clearly identified. That would enhance women opportunities. Of course, because some of these laws, rules, and regulation normally impedes and even deeper women inequality. It's also important for us to also take cognizance of the various sectors where women can take opportunities of enhancing their trade relation. Opportunities in the industrial sectors, opportunity in the agro-based industrial areas, opportunities in other sectors, which I think is very much fundamental. Because having an in-depth understanding about some of these sectors where women can exploit the advantage in terms of enhancing their competitiveness would also actually foster their participation in terms of decision makings, in terms of raising their awareness, and in terms of enhancing their competitiveness. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone. As I close, I just wanted to muse on the fact that isn't it interesting that the solution to all of South Africa's problem is always get the foreigners away. Like, if we're talking AfCFTA, then it can't also then be, I can't bake bread because there are foreigners in my country. That's just as a problem and as a solution seems to me to be something that's an excuse rather than as an actual point of discourse. But thank you everyone for your attendance today. Thank you for your questions, your inputs. Thank you to all of the speakers. I look forward to seeing you in the next session where Dr. Sinazo is going to be moderating for us. You can go have tea if you like tea.